The wind howled like a wounded wolf across the Wyoming mountains. Snow clung to the pines like thick wool, and the sky wore a heavy gray veil, threatening more. Most men would have stayed inside, but not Silas Hart. Silas was the kind of man the mountain respected, solitary, weathered, and made of grit. His cabin sat 3 miles past the last creek where even game trails grew thin. He hadn't spoken to a soul in 4 months, not since his last trip into town for flour and tobacco. That morning, he'd left his cabin to check his traps before the worst of the storm rolled in. He never expected to find her. She lay like a broken doll in the snow, curled in on herself, barely covered in rags. Her cheeks were raw with frostbite, and her lips were blue. Silas's first thought wasn't fear or suspicion. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive all these years. Move fast, think later. God almighty, he muttered, throwing off his coat and kneeling beside her. Her hair was long, matted with ice, but something about her face, fragile, smudged with pain, cut right through his guarded heart. "Don't you quit now," he said, hoisting her into his arms. He wrapped her tightly in his wool cloak and laid her gently onto the sled he used for hauling firewood. Every step back to the cabin was slow and brutal, the snow knee-deep, the wind unrelenting. But Silas never stopped. He didn't even think to ask himself why he was doing it. By the time he got her inside, the storm had swallowed the forest whole. He stoked the fire until it roared, filled a kettle, and laid her on his cot. Her pulse was weak, but there. She hadn't stirred once. He removed her torn boots, one foot blackened, the other bleeding, and wrapped them in clean rags. She was freezing. Too freezing. He had to warm her up fast. He moved quickly, placing warm rocks wrapped in towels near her sides, then sat close, pulling another quilt over them both. "You better have a name, girl," he whispered, looking down at her pale face. "Because if you survive this, I'd like to know what to call the woman who nearly died on my land." 2 days passed. She drifted between life and somewhere colder. Silas barely slept. He spoon-fed her broth when she could sip, changed her bandages, and talked out loud like a fool, just to keep the silence from swallowing him whole. Then came the morning of the 3rd day. He was cleaning a cut on her arm when he heard it, a faint sound soft as wind over snow. "Please!" He froze. Her lips had moved. "What did you say?" He leaned close, heart racing. Her eyelids fluttered, and this time her voice came again, hoarse, trembling. "Don't let them find me." Silas felt something tighten in his chest, not fear. Something older, something sharper. He looked at her, really looked. And in that moment he knew. She wasn't just a lost traveler. She was running from something. And whatever it wasn't finished chasing her yet. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat near the fire, knife in hand, eyes flicking to the door every time the wind pressed against it like a hand trying to push through. Her voice haunted him. "Don't let them find me." The mountains were cruel, yes, but people could be worse. The woman stirred again around midnight. Her fever had broken, and color had returned to her face, but her expression still wore shadows, deep ones. When her eyes finally opened, they didn't see him right away. They looked past him, through him. Only when she flinched did he realize she was awake. "Easy," Silas said, setting the knife down where she could see it. "You're safe here." She sat up slowly, blankets falling to her lap. Her eyes darted across the room, rough-hewn walls, dried herbs above the hearth, a rifle in the corner, and him. "You pulled me from the snow," she said, her voice faint but steady. "I did." There was a long silence, then she asked, "Why?" Silas shrugged. "Didn't seem right to leave you there." That earned him the ghost of a smile. "Most men wouldn't have bothered." "I'm not most men," he said simply. She looked away as if unsure what to make of that. By morning she could stand, with help. Silas brewed coffee thick and bitter, and she drank it like it was the first warmth she'd had in years. He gave her an old pair of wool socks, and when he turned to stoke the fire, she asked the question he'd expected since the moment she spoke. "What's your name?" He hesitated only a moment. "Silas Hart. And you?" She looked down at her cup. "Clara. Just Clara." Silas didn't press. Something in the way she said her name made it clear. Clara was a woman with walls. High ones. And right now he didn't need to climb them, just make sure no one else tried to tear them down. Over the next 2 days, Clara regained her strength. She limped around the cabin, helped chop onions, mended a torn shirt from his pile of old clothes. But every time he looked at her, Silas could see it, the weight she carried. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt and secrets. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was simple, unspoken things. Wood stacked high enough? I can add more if the storm turns. Sleep all right? Didn't dream. That's good. But on the fourth day, as the snow softened under the afternoon sun, Clara stood by the window and said, "You live alone?" Silas nodded. "Ain't much out here for two." Her fingers traced the edge of the frosted glass. "There is, if you're hiding." Silas turned from the stove. "Are you?" She didn't answer, but her hand tightened around the curtain. That night, just before he turned in, he found her outside on the porch, wrapped in a quilt. "You shouldn't be out here," he said gently. "Still cold enough to freeze you solid." "I needed air," she replied, not moving. "Needed to remember what quiet feels like without fear." Silas stood beside her, silence falling between them. "I wasn't always mute," she said softly. "It wasn't my voice that was taken. It was my trust." Silas's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Just stood with her, shoulder to shoulder, as the wind moved through the trees. After a long moment, Clara turned to him. "If they come looking, will you send me away?" He looked into her eyes, dark, searching, and fragile. "No," he said. "But if they come, I hope they're ready for the mountain." The morning after their talk on the porch, Silas found himself splitting more firewood than usual. Not because he needed it, but because it gave him something to do with his hands, something to help quiet the storm brewing in his chest. Clara had asked if he'd send her away, and the truth was, he couldn't. Wouldn't. There was something about her that unsettled him. Not in fear, but in a way that reminded him of old wounds he thought had long since scarred over. She didn't belong to the mountain, but the mountain had her now, just like it had him. Inside, Clara moved carefully, sweeping the floor with the grace of someone who'd once known comfort. Her fingers were calloused, but her movements held elegance. It made Silas wonder, what life did she leave behind? What kind of man did she run from? Later that afternoon, he caught her staring at a faded photograph on the mantel. It was an old tintype. His mother, his father, and a younger Silas with eyes full of fire. Before war, before grief, before he chose the wild over the world, Clara didn't ask questions. She simply said, "You were once loved." Silas paused. "And you?" Clara looked away. "I was once owned." Silas didn't push. He walked over, set down the hatchet, and said the only thing he knew to be true. "You're not anymore." That evening the temperature dropped hard. Snow hissed against the windows. Silas stoked the fire to full blaze and offered her the cot. She shook her head. "You take it tonight. I'm stronger now." He didn't argue. But when the wind howled and the cabin creaked, he heard soft footsteps cross the floor. Clara stood near the hearth, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "Can't sleep?" "No," she said. "I keep dreaming of boots in the snow, and hands dragging me back." Silas stood, pulled an extra blanket from the shelf, and handed it to her. "You won't be dragged anywhere, Clara." She didn't move, her voice barely a whisper. "How can you be sure?" "Because if anyone tries," he said, his voice low and even, "they'll have to step over me first." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, not with fear, but with something close to belief. The next day she ventured beyond the cabin, only a few paces at first, her body still sore, legs weak. But she smiled in the snow for the first time. Silas watched from the porch, arms crossed, heart strangely light. She was still a ghost in many ways, but ghosts didn't laugh at pine cones falling from trees. She turned to him, cheeks pink from cold and effort. "You ever leave this place?" "Once a month. Supply run. Nearest town's 12 miles. Clara hesitated. "And if someone's looking for me there?" Silas shrugged. "I know how to keep quiet, and the shopkeep owes me more than a few favors." She tilted her head. "Why are you helping me, Silas?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe because I spent too many winters thinking no one ever would have helped me." That night she cooked dinner. Nothing fancy. Beans, rabbit stew. But it was the first warm meal cooked by another soul in his cabin in years. She hummed as she stirred, something soft and almost forgotten. Silas sat at the table watching her. He didn't realize how much silence had weighed on him, until it was filled with her presence. And though she still hadn't told him her secret, he could feel it rising. Like snow melting under a hidden spring, something was coming, and he was no longer sure if he was preparing for danger or for change. It snowed again that night, but softer this time. Gentle, like the land was finally breathing again. Silas awoke early. The cabin was still dark, but Clara wasn't in her cot. For a heartbeat, panic gripped his chest, but then he heard her out back, feeding the hens and humming that same old tune from the night before. He stood at the window and watched her. There was something strange about it. This quiet harmony, This sudden presence in a life that had once known only solitude. She didn't belong to him. And yet somehow, she fit into his world like she'd been carved from the same mountain stone. When Clara returned inside, cheeks red and nose running, she smiled. "You don't mind I let the hens out?" "Not at all," Silas replied. "They could use company." She laughed lightly, then stepped closer. "You always keep your rifle loaded by the door?" Silas didn't answer right away. "Always, even before you came." Clara's gaze lingered on the weapon. "I heard a sound last night. I thought I imagined it." "What kind of sound?" She bit her lip. "Metal, like a latch, maybe a door." Silas's jaw tightened. "You sure?" "No," she admitted. "But I've learned not to ignore bad feelings." He spent the rest of the morning checking the perimeter. Nothing out of place, no tracks, no broken brush. But the forest had a way of hiding things. The snow was deep enough to swallow secrets whole. When he returned, Clara was sitting by the fire with his old trail journal in hand. "I hope you don't mind," she said. It was open. Silas hung up his coat and sat down across from her. "You found my deepest, most scandalous thoughts, I see." She smirked. "So far all I've found are complaints about deer stealing from your traps and a rather passionate hatred for onions." "They ruin perfectly good stew," he muttered. Clara grew quiet, her fingers tracing the worn leather of the journal. "You ever write about people? Anyone you've lost?" Silas hesitated. "Once. Someone you loved?" He looked into the fire. "Someone I almost did." The air between them grew still, and then Clara, voice low, said, "I lost someone too, but not to death, to cruelty." She didn't elaborate, but she didn't have to. Silas heard more in her silence than most folks said in a lifetime. Later, as they shared supper, Clara looked up and said, "You ever think about what it would be like to start again?" Silas paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "I've spent so long forgetting," he said. "I don't know if I remember how to begin." Clara nodded. "Maybe you don't have to remember. Maybe you just begin anyway." That night the wind picked up again. But this time it wasn't the weather that woke Silas. It was the horses. They were restless, snorting, shifting. He grabbed his rifle without a word and stepped outside. The trees stood quiet, but the air was wrong, too still. And then he saw them. 2 sets of prints, not from boots, hooves, fresh, headed west. Someone had passed nearby, watching, listening, but hadn't come to the cabin yet. Silas returned inside and locked the door behind him. Clara sat up in bed, wide-eyed. "What is it?" she whispered. He looked at her, voice calm but steady. "We're not alone out here anymore." Clara didn't ask questions. Not right away. But she saw the change in Silas's eyes the moment he returned from outside. He looked like a man remembering war. Silas set the rifle down by the fire, his jaw tight. "Tracks," he said. "Horseback. 2 of them. They didn't come to the cabin, but they circled close. Real close." Clara swallowed. "Could it be trappers?" He shook his head. "Trappers don't sneak around cabins in the middle of a blizzard." Her hands gripped the wool blanket tighter. "Then they're looking for me." Silas didn't confirm it, but his silence said enough. The next morning, he saddled his gelding and hitched the old mule cart. "I'm going to town," he told Clara, checking the rifle strapped to the saddle. "You'll stay here. Door locked behind me. If anyone knocks, you don't answer unless it's me. Understood?" She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "You think they'll show again?" "I think if they do," he said, "they won't knock first." Then he paused, added gently, "But I'll be back by nightfall." She stood on the porch as he rode off, quilt wrapped around her shoulders, snow falling like whispers from the sky. Silas rarely went to town except for supplies and salt. But this trip wasn't for food. It was for answers. He rode into Granger around noon. The streets were slushy and half-frozen, the air thick with smoke and suspicion. The townsfolk gave him the same sideways glances they always had, like a man who'd spent too long with wolves. At the general store, he spoke quietly with the owner, Jed Hollis, a wiry man with ears sharper than most. "Anyone come through asking questions?" Silas asked, voice low. Jed raised an eyebrow. "You mean trouble?" "I mean men on horseback, not local." Jed nodded slowly. "Couple strangers rode in yesterday. Asked about the mountains. Seemed too clean to be trappers. One of them had a scar across his nose, mean eyes." Silas's fists clenched. "Did they say what they were after?" Jed hesitated. "Said they were tracking someone. A girl. Claimed she stole from them. Wouldn't give details." "Did they leave?" "Not yet. They're boarding over at the stable house." Silas didn't linger. He left coin for a sack of dried goods, just for cover, and turned his horse back toward the hills before sundown. The snow had thickened, and the wind had begun its climb into night. It was almost dark by the time he reached the ridge. He could see smoke from the cabin chimney in the distance, and something else, a figure, moving near the trees. Too far to make out clearly, but close enough to send a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Back at the cabin, Clara stood near the fire, a butcher knife tucked into the waistband of her skirt. She'd heard something, branches snapping beyond the back door, footsteps in snow that didn't belong to Silas. Then silence. She kept the fire low and her breath shallow, until she heard the sound she'd been aching for all day. Boots on the porch. A knock. 2 sharp raps. Then a pause. Then his voice. "It's me!" She rushed to unlock the door. Silas stepped in, eyes scanning the room like a man ready for a fight. "You were right," he said. "They're here, and they're not far." Clara's voice shook. "Then it's time I told you the truth." He met her eyes. "I figured as much." She took a breath. "My name isn't Clara, it's Rosalie. And I wasn't just running from men." Her voice broke, and she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I was promised to one of them, against my will, and I escaped on his wedding night." Silas didn't speak at first. The silence hung heavy between them, only the crackle of the fire daring to break it. Rosalie, Clara no longer, stood straight despite the tremble in her hands. "Promised?" he repeated finally. She nodded. "My father owed a debt. Land, cattle, protection. I don't even know all of it. But instead of paying, he gave me." Silas's jaw tightened, his hands flexing into fists. "To who?" "Wade Keaton," she whispered. "A cattle baron out of Nebraska territory, known for making problems disappear. He came with 2 men. They picked me up like I was property, not a person." She shivered despite the fire. "The first night, I knew I wouldn't survive a second." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing bruises, old and faded, but still haunting. Silas's breath caught in his throat. "I didn't have a plan," she said, voice flat. "I ran in the middle of the night, took one of their horses and rode until it collapsed. I walked after that, through snow. I thought I was going to die out there." Silas swallowed hard. "You almost did." She looked at him, eyes wide. "I didn't expect kindness, not from a stranger. I didn't think men like you still existed." He shook his head. "I ain't a hero." "You didn't have to be," she said softly. "You just had to be safe." For the first time in days, something shifted between them. A kind of understanding. Not pity, not rescue. Something deeper. Recognition. He had his own past. She didn't ask about it, but he saw the way her gaze softened when he didn't press her for more. "I'll keep you hidden," Silas said. "But we need to be smart. Wade's the kind of man who won't stop just because winter slows him down." Rosalie nodded. "I know. He thinks he owns me. That's the kind of man he is." Silas stared into the fire. "Then we'll teach him he doesn't." That night they made plans, quiet ones. Silas pulled out maps and marked old trapping trails that wound deeper into the forest, places even locals avoided. There were caves, overhangs, canyons the snow buried so deep only those who knew the land could survive. "If it comes to it," he said, "we run. We go into the high ridge, take the old bear path through Elk Jaw Canyon. They won't follow, not in that snow." "And if they do?" she asked. Silas met her eyes. "They won't make it out." Later, as she curled into the cot, Rosalie whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not asking more than I can give." Silas didn't look up from his seat by the fire, but he answered, quiet and sure. "I figure if you wanted to give more, you would." She smiled faintly. "You always been that patient?" He chuckled. "No, but something about you makes me want to be." The snow thickened again the next day, blanketing the valley in silence. But silence didn't mean safety. Not when 2 riders still hadn't shown their faces, not when footsteps were still waiting to return, and not when a man like Wade Keaton was known for tracking what he believed was his, no matter the blood left behind. For 2 days the storm raged, the kind of storm that swallowed sound and buried fences, turning landmarks into white ghosts. But Silas knew his land too well to get lost. Every ridge, every bend of the creek, every shadow on the hill, he'd lived too many winters alone not to recognize them like the lines on his own hands. He used the time to teach Rosalie how to fire a rifle. At first, her hands trembled when she held the weapon. The weight, the memory. But Silas was patient. He stood behind her, not too close, but close enough that she felt steadied. "You ain't aiming to kill," he told her. "You're aiming to protect." She nodded. "I've never pulled a trigger." "I hope you never have to," he said. "But if it's you or them—" "I know," she finished, and the way she squared her shoulders told him she truly did. That night over supper, Rosalie asked, "Why'd you come up here, Silas?" He stirred the beans slowly. "Because the war taught me I wasn't made for crowds." "Which war?" He met her gaze. "The only one that taught me how men die too easy for someone else's idea of glory." Her voice softened. "And the mountains gave you peace?" He shook his head. "No, but they gave me quiet. That was enough." She smiled, tired and true. "Until I came along." Silas chuckled, a low rumble that surprised even him. You're the loudest quiet I've ever known. The next morning, hoofprints returned. Silas spotted them early, fresh in the snow, looping back across the ridge. Whoever was watching had circled again. Closer this time, less careful. He knelt near the tracks, fingers brushing over them like reading braille. 2 riders, same as before, but they're looking harder now. Back at the cabin, Rosalie helped him pack a canvas bundle. Jerky, flint, ammunition, a pair of boiled wool socks she'd mended with old yarn. You really think we should leave? Silas nodded. Not yet, but soon. First, I want to see how bold they are. If they come close enough to smell wood smoke, I'll know they're ready to move. And what if they try something before that? Then they'll regret waking up this morning. That night, the tension in the air was so thick it pressed on their skin. Rosalie didn't sleep. Neither did Silas. Around midnight, a soft knock came at the back wall. Not the door, the wall. Rosalie's breath caught. Silas was already standing, rifle in hand, fingers still and calm. A voice followed, gravelly and low. We know she's in there. We just want what's owed. Silas didn't answer. Give her up and no one gets hurt. Still nothing. Then, you got till sunup. The snow settled again. The footsteps faded. Rosalie turned to Silas, her face pale. He's here. That was Wade. Silas didn't flinch. Let him wait for the sun. Let's see if he still wants her then. But both of them knew. Wade Keaton wasn't a man who waited. He was a man who took. And the sun was coming, with blood if necessary. The night was a long one. Rosalie sat near the hearth, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, while Silas paced the room slowly, rifle always in reach, ears tuned to every gust of wind. The knock on the wall hadn't just been a threat. It was a promise. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the cold deepened. Ice crystallized on the windows and the sky turned pale blue, clear and silent like it was holding its breath. They'll come today, Silas said. The question is whether they come loud or quiet. Rosalie didn't reply. She was too busy tucking a small pistol into the folds of her coat. Silas noticed but said nothing. She was no longer the girl who had collapsed in the snow. They made ready as best they could. Silas dug 2 trenches in the snow behind the cabin, giving him cover if things went south. Rosalie prepared kindling and spare lanterns inside, just in case they had to set fire to the place and run. The mule cart was already packed with supplies, stashed under a tarp in the tree line. By mid-morning, the birds stopped singing. Then came the creak of leather, the snort of horses, footsteps crunching snow. Silas peeked from his back window and saw them. 2 men, both armed, one tall and lean with a scar across his nose, the other wide-shouldered and cruel-faced. And behind them, Wade Keaton. He was dressed in black, his coat trimmed in expensive fur, boots polished like a city man's, not a rider's. But his eyes were the worst of it. Cold, empty, like a wolf that had tasted blood and wanted more. Silas stepped out onto the porch slowly, rifle in plain sight but lowered. His voice was steady. That's far enough. Wade dismounted. Mr. Hart, is it? My men say you've been keeping a guest that don't belong to you. She's not property, Silas replied. She don't belong to anyone. Wade smirked. Everything has an owner out here. Land, livestock, people. Not anymore. Wade took a slow step forward. You've no idea what she's stolen from me. This is business, not personal. She didn't steal anything, Silas said. She escaped. Now Wade's smile vanished. That girl's mine by contract. Bought legal. Promised and paid for. Her father signed. I don't care if God signed it, Silas cut in. She's not going back. Inside the cabin, Rosalie gripped the pistol tight, listening to every word. She knew this was it, the moment that would decide everything. Her breath was shallow, but her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Outside, Wade's voice turned dark. You think you can stop me? You in a shack in the trees? Silas lifted his rifle. Try me. One of the hired guns twitched. Bad idea. Silas fired before the man's hand even reached his holster. The crack of the shot echoed through the trees. The man dropped like stone. The second one raised his weapon, too slow. Rosalie stepped out the front door and shot him in the shoulder. The man spun and fell backward into the snow, screaming. Only Wade remained standing. He looked between them, Silas with the rifle, Rosalie with the pistol, and something flickered in his eyes. Not fear. Calculation. You'll regret this, Wade said coldly. You've made an enemy that doesn't forgive. Rosalie stepped forward. And you made a mistake thinking I'd stay silent forever. Silas spoke last. You've got 2 options. You ride out of these woods and never come back, or you don't ride out at all. Wade stared at him, unmoving. Then slowly he turned back to his horse. Mounted. This isn't the end, he said without looking back. Silas raised his rifle again. If you turn around once, it will be. Wade didn't. He disappeared into the trees, leaving behind blood in the snow and the weight of unfinished business. Inside the cabin, silence fell once more. Rosalie sat down hard, the pistol slipping from her hand. Silas knelt beside her, gently brushing snow from her hair. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I think, for the first time in a long while, I might be." Silas didn't speak again for a moment, but deep in his chest something shifted, and he knew. This woman wasn't passing through. She was becoming part of the mountain. Wade was gone, but his shadow lingered. The air in the cabin remained tight with unspoken fears and tension that wouldn't melt with the snow. Silas kept his rifle closer. Rosalie checked the locks more than once each night. Trust was growing between them, but safety was still something borrowed, not owned. 2 days passed. Wade didn't return. No signs of riders. No prints. No sound but the usual whisper of pines swaying and creek ice creaking under moonlight. But neither of them relaxed, because men like Wade didn't forget. On the third morning, Rosalie woke before dawn. She stepped out into the cold alone, letting the sharp mountain air sting her skin and steady her mind. She stared at the ridgeline, where blue light peeked behind the trees, and whispered into the silence. "I'm still here," her voice no longer hidden. Inside, Silas was already stirring. He poured coffee, listening for her return, and when she stepped back inside, he greeted her with a soft smile, a rarity from a man whose face had been carved more by loss than laughter. "You should have called me," he said. She smiled gently. "I needed to do it on my own." That afternoon, Rosalie helped mend fence posts down the slope near the tree line. She moved slower than Silas, but she was no longer fragile. He watched her hammer nails into weather-worn beams, sleeves rolled up, strands of wind-blown hair stuck to her cheeks. She was adapting to this life, to his life. "I never thought I'd see the day I built something that didn't feel like a prison," she said quietly. Silas glanced over. "It's still rough out here, not much comfort." Rosalie looked toward the ridge. "Comfort isn't the same as peace. Out here I can breathe. I can hear my own thoughts again. I can choose." He didn't respond right away, but his eyes lingered on her longer than before. Then gently, "You could stay, you know." The words hung in the air like snowflakes that refused to fall. Rosalie blinked. "Stay?" Silas set down the post he was holding. "You don't owe me anything, and I'm not asking because I want thanks. But you fit here. And maybe I do better with someone to talk to besides the hens." She laughed softly, brushing a tear away before it fully formed. "Do you mean it?" she asked. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. "And what would we be, just neighbors?" Silas stepped closer, eyes never leaving hers. "We'd be whatever you wanted us to be. I'm not here to own you, just to stand beside you." That night she sat beside him near the fire, not across from him, not apart, shoulder to shoulder. He handed her a mug of hot cider. Their fingers brushed, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. She looked up at him, the glow from the hearth dancing in her eyes. "I've never known a man who saw me and didn't try to shape me," she said. Silas held her gaze. "Then it's about time you met one who won't." They didn't kiss, not yet, but something passed between them, something gentler than touch, something rooted in knowing. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, but inside the cabin, the mountain was quiet, and so were their hearts. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. The snow melted slowly from the eaves. The creek near the back hill swelled with ice runoff. Birds returned to the pines, filling the mornings with hesitant song, and with each passing day, the land softened, just as something inside Rosalie and Silas did the same. She stayed, not with a grand declaration, not with ceremony. Just one morning, her bag remained unpacked, her boots drying near the fire, and neither of them spoke of her leaving again. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full. One afternoon, Silas taught her how to fish using a line made of old twine and patience. She caught nothing but a branch, but her laughter when she reeled it in echoed across the valley and stirred something deep in him. He hadn't known he missed the sound of laughter until hers found a place inside his cabin. That night, she braided a loop of horsehair and placed it on the mantel. "For luck," she said. "In my village, we hung these for new beginnings." Silas looked at it for a long time. "You think this is a beginning?" She nodded. "If we let it be. But even beginnings have shadows." Silas returned from a supply run one morning with a message carved into the fence post outside the cabin. A single word scorched into the wood with fire. Soon, he didn't tell Rosalie right away. He told himself it was because he didn't want to worry her. But the truth ran deeper. He didn't want to break the illusion of peace they had fought so hard to build. Still, that night, he moved the rifle back to its place beside the door. And he sat by the fire until the embers died, listening to every creak in the wood, every sigh of wind against the window panes. Rosalie noticed the shift in him. "You've been quiet again," she said as they shared breakfast the next morning. He stirred his coffee. "Just thinking." "About the man who wrote that word?" Silas's spoon stopped. She saw it in his eyes. "You saw it too?" he asked. "I see everything now," she said gently. "I've spent too long pretending not to." He looked up at her, the weight of unspoken things between them. "If he comes again," Rosalie set her hand over his, "we'll face him, together." That evening, as dusk spread across the ridge, Silas pulled out the old lantern from the cupboard. It had only been used once, when his father passed. It was a symbol, in some quiet way, of standing vigil. He placed it by the porch and lit it. Rosalie watched from the doorway. "For him?" she asked. Silas shook his head. "For us. A light to remind the dark we're not afraid anymore." She stepped beside him, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. "I think the mountain was always meant to hold two," she whispered. The sky above turned velvet, stars scattered like frost. Inside, the fire glowed. Outside, far beyond the trees, something moved, quiet, careful, waiting. But the cabin stood strong, and for the first time in her life, Rosalie didn't run from the shadow. She faced it, with someone beside her. Morning broke with an eerie stillness. No wind, no bird song. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. Silas rose before first light, instincts sharp. He checked the traps, the mule, the perimeter. All quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, waiting to be broken by something you didn't want to hear. Rosalie was already up, grinding coffee beans by hand. She didn't ask him where he'd gone. She just handed him a cup when he returned, her eyes filled with silent understanding. They were past needing to explain things now. Midday brought the sound they both feared. Hoofbeats. Not on the main trail, on the ridge. The higher path that only someone familiar with the terrain would know. Someone desperate or determined. Silas peered through the glass, jaw clenched. "Two riders again," he muttered. No sign of Wade. Rosalie stood beside him. "That doesn't mean he's not watching." He turned to her. "You still want to face this with me?" "I didn't stay to be protected," she said calmly. "I stayed because I'm not running anymore." There it was again, that quiet steel in her voice. It made him feel something deeper than pride, something like belonging. They made the plan with few words. Rosalie would remain inside, hidden at the rear corner behind the stove, out of view, but within reach of her pistol. Silas would wait on the porch, rifle across his lap, lantern lit again in broad daylight. He wanted to be seen, wanted them to know this wasn't a place for cowards or thieves. The riders arrived just before sundown. 2 men. Different from the last time. Hired hands, clearly, but not professionals. Desperate. Paid for muscle, not for brains. They dismounted and kept their hands near their guns, but didn't draw. Silas stood as they approached. "This is private land," he called out. One of them stepped forward, spitting into the snow. "We're not here for trouble, mister. Just a message." Silas didn't flinch. "Go ahead. Wade Keaton says this is your last chance. He wants the girl. Says she's his by law, and if he don't get her, he'll burn every tree between here and town to the roots." Silas stared at them. "Then he better bring water." The taller one narrowed his eyes. "You sure about this?" "You're the one on my land," Silas said, voice hardening. "You really want to bet your life on a man who sends others to do his dirty work?" The shorter one glanced at his partner. "He's got a point." "Shut up!" the tall one snapped, but neither moved. Silas took a step forward, rifle loose but deadly in his grip. "You walk away now, no harm. But come back with Keaton and I won't aim to miss." The silence that followed wasn't brave, it was calculated. "And then?" The tall man nodded. "Fine, but you best be ready. He's coming." They turned, mounted, rode out. When the sound of hoofbeats finally vanished into the valley, Rosalie stepped out from the cabin, her face pale but firm. "You think they'll be back soon?" she asked. Silas nodded. "Next time it won't be messengers." She stepped beside him, her voice low. "Then we finish it." That night, Silas sharpened his knife with slow, even strokes. Rosalie braided her hair tightly, hands steady. The light of the fire flickered on their faces, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. But neither of them feared ghosts anymore. They were no longer just hiding. They were standing their ground. It snowed again that night. Not the soft kind that blanketed the world in peace, but a biting, wind-driven storm that rattled the windows and clawed at the roof like fingers seeking entry. Inside the cabin, Silas and Rosalie didn't sleep, not even in shifts. They stayed close to the fire, weapons ready, words few. Everything that could be said had already passed between them in quieter moments, in glances, in quiet meals, in the comfort of shared silence. Now all that remained was preparation and resolve. Before dawn, Silas saddled the mule and packed the sled with a spare rifle, 2 bedrolls, dried meat, and the tin of matches he kept for emergencies. "If things go wrong," he said, "we head for Elkjaw Canyon." Rosalie nodded. "And if we don't make it?" He looked her square in the eyes. "We make it." There was no romantic promise in his tone, no sugar-coated hope, just truth. That was the only way Silas knew how to speak. By sunrise, the mountain was silent again, the kind of silence that comes after a decision's already been made. Rosalie stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes on the trail that led down into the pines. "I dreamed about him last night," she said quietly. "He had a fire in one hand and a chain in the other." Silas stepped beside her, rifle slung across his back. "You're not a prisoner anymore." She looked up at him. "And you're not alone anymore." That truth hit him deeper than any bullet ever could. They didn't have to wait long. Just before noon, the sound of hooves came again. 3 riders this time. One of them wore a black coat, fur-trimmed, the familiar glint of arrogance in every movement. Wade Keaton. He rode slow, like a man who believed the world would part for him. Silas stepped out from the porch, Rosalie just behind the curtain inside, heart pounding but hands steady. Wade dismounted without a word, letting the 2 other men fan out behind him. Then he looked up at Silas and smiled. "Well," he said, "man of the woods with a woman in hiding. It always ends the same, doesn't it?" Silas said nothing. Wade took another step forward. "You don't know what you're sheltering. She's not a victim. She's a thief. She stole a horse, gold, and my name." "I don't care about the horse," Silas replied. "Or your name." Wade's smile faltered. "You will, when your cabin's ash and she's screaming beside it." Silas didn't raise his rifle. Not yet. "You threaten what I've built," he said calmly. "That's the last mistake you'll make." Wade scoffed and reached for his revolver. But Rosalie was faster. The shot rang out from behind the cabin wall. Wade's gun flew from his hand, the bullet slicing across his knuckles. He roared in pain, stumbling back as Silas raised his own weapon and leveled it between Wade's eyes. "Tell your men to drop theirs," he growled. The 2 henchmen hesitated, seeing the blood, the fire in Rosalie's stance as she stepped forward beside Silas, unshaking. "We don't want this," one muttered. "You already got it," Silas snapped. Wade clutched his bleeding hand, glaring with animal hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Rosalie said, stepping fully into view. "You don't own me anymore. And if you ever come back here," she pointed the gun straight at his chest, "you'll never leave again." The mountain held its breath. Then slowly, like a man learning fear for the first time, Wade turned, wordless, pale. He mounted and rode off, this time without threats, without promises, just silence. His men followed, and then the clearing was still. Rosalie's knees gave slightly, and Silas caught her by the shoulders. She looked up at him, blinking hard. "I didn't think I could do it." "You didn't have to," he said. "But you did." And in his arms, she finally felt like she had chosen her place in the world, not fallen into it. That night, the mountain was quiet again. Not from fear, but from peace. And in that cabin lit by firelight, 2 souls, once lost, once hunted, sat side by side, no longer hiding, no longer waiting. They had chosen each other, and the mountain had chosen them back. Spring arrived in earnest. The snow began its slow retreat from the ridges, revealing stubborn green beneath. Icicles dripped into puddles. The creek that once whispered now rushed with confidence. Life was returning to the land. And life, in its own quiet way, was returning to the cabin too. Rosalie stood in the garden plot behind the house, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the thawing soil. She worked in rhythm, dig, drop seed, cover, her brow damp, her eyes clear. It wasn't easy. Her back ached, her knees bruised. But she smiled. Inside, Silas watched from the window, coffee in hand, heart quieter than it had been in years. Some things changed quickly. Rosalie had claimed half the cabin with ease, her shawl over the chair, her boots beside his, her voice filling empty corners with song, not loudly, not boldly, but like wind threading through the trees, just enough to remind him he wasn't alone. Other things took time. She still flinched at certain sounds, raised voices from passing traders or the sharp crack of splitting wood. Silas never asked, never rushed her. He just kept the lantern lit every evening and sat beside her as the fire warmed their silences. One day in early April, she found him on the porch with a rough block of cedar and his carving knife. "You carving something?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He nodded, not looking up. "Figured I'd try my hand at a nameplate, something for the fence." "What will it say?" He hesitated, then gave a shy smile. "Hartstead." She blinked. "Hartstead?" He shrugged. "A home should have a name. Figured yours should be on it, too." She sat beside him, silent for a long moment. You think it's really mine? Silas turned to her. If you want it. Rosalie rested her head on his shoulder. I do. That night, as they sat near the fire, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her skirt pocket. Yellowed. Worn. My mother wrote this before she passed, she said. I've carried it for years. Never read it out loud before. Silas didn't speak, just nodded. She unfolded it, her voice soft but certain. Love is not what finds us. It is what we build when no one is watching. In quiet rooms, with open hearts, and hands that stay. She looked at Silas, emotion catching in her throat. I think this is the first time I've believed it. Outside, the wind rustled the pines. Inside, two hands reached across worn wood, found each other, and held tight. There were no vows, no rings. But in that cabin on the mountain, where firelight met frost and silence had once ruled, something sacred was built. Not from rescue, but from choice. The nameplate went up the next day. Silas nailed it into the post just past the gate. Rough cedar, carved deep with firm strokes. Hartstead. It wasn't just a name, it was a statement. That this land, once wild and empty, now held belonging. Not just his, not just hers, theirs. Rosalie stood beside him as he finished, her hand resting on his arm. I never thought I'd see my name in wood, she said quietly. Silas glanced at her. You didn't. You saw it in stone first when you decided to stay. She didn't need to answer. The way her fingers curled gently around his coat sleeve said everything. That week, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. They chopped wood, fished the creek, traded wild herbs for flour and sugar from town. Rosalie mended clothes and wrote in the notebook Silas gave her. A gift, though he never asked what she filled it with. She would sit in the morning sun, writing as the birds sang, hair pulled back with twine, skin kissed with light. He liked watching her like that. She didn't know. He never told her. But he thought maybe, someday, she would read him the words she wrote. He hoped so, but peace is never permanent on the mountain. It was late in the afternoon when the boy arrived. Barely 16, riding a mule, cheeks red from cold and eyes too big for his frame. Silas met him at the gate. You Silas Hart? The boy asked, breathless. I am. He handed over a folded note. From the sheriff. Told me to ride fast. Silas unfolded it, eyes scanning the words in silence. Then he nodded once, slowly. The boy looked nervous. Something bad? Silas handed him a coin and said only, no worse than usual. Inside, Rosalie read the letter with him. It was short, direct. Wade Keaton had been found dead. Slumped against a fence post 2 towns east, his body cold, his coat missing. No witnesses, no suspects, no justice. Just an ending. Rosalie set the letter down. Her fingers trembled slightly. I thought I'd feel relief, she whispered. But I feel nothing. Like I've been holding a weight for so long that now that it's gone, I don't know how to stand. Silas reached across the table, took her hand gently. You don't have to stand yet, he said. Just rest. I've got you. That night she cried. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't anymore. And that, somehow, was the strangest feeling of all. Silas didn't say a word. He simply held her, the fire warm beside them, and listened to her breathing as it steadied again. She had weathered storms, outrun monsters, spoken her truth. Now she was free. Spring deepened into early summer. The grass rose, the hills bloomed, and Rosalie laughed more, not because she needed to, but because she could. One morning, while gathering herbs by the creek, she called over her shoulder, Hey, Silas. He looked up from the saddle he was mending. She smiled. You still think you're not a hero? He grunted. I'm a man with a sore back and 2 burned biscuits. She walked over and kissed his cheek, surprising them both. Well, she whispered, that's the kind of hero I've always prayed for. Summer came like a hush rather than a blaze. Up on the mountain, heat didn't shout. It whispered. The wind carried wildflower scent instead of snow. The creek ran faster, clearer. Birds sang bold and loud as if no longer afraid to be heard. Rosalie thrived in it. She wore light cotton dresses now, her hair braided down her back, her laughter unafraid. She planted sunroot and beans, pressed herbs between pages of her notebook, and began leaving notes for Silas in odd places. Above the wash basin, tucked inside his flannel pocket, carved lightly into wood. Most were simple. Thank you. Still choosing this? Don't burn the stew. Some, though, said more than she could speak aloud. One evening in late June, Silas returned from a long ride up the northern ridge. He found Rosalie sitting on the porch steps, fingers tangled in the hem of her dress, gaze cast toward the valley. She didn't hear him at first. What's got your thoughts running? He asked as he tied the horse. She glanced up, smiled faintly. I saw a deer by the tree line. She had a fawn. That's a good sign, he said. Rosalie nodded, then added softly, I wonder if she was scared when it came. Silas sat beside her. Probably. And I wonder, she continued, if it's possible to be both terrified and full of love. Silas didn't speak. He simply reached over, laid his hand gently atop hers, and she turned it over, interlaced their fingers without hesitation. That night she woke from a dream. Not a nightmare. Not quite. Just a memory dressed in fog. She lay beside Silas in the quiet dark, their cots pushed together since spring. He was already awake, as if he'd known she'd stir. I keep thinking something will take this away, she whispered. Silas stared at the ceiling beams. There's nothing left to take it. I never thought peace would feel like something I'd have to learn. It is, he said softly. But you're learning. She turned to face him. And you? I never thought I'd let anyone close again. But here you are. The next morning they took the mule down to the river bend to collect smooth stones for the garden. Rosalie loved how round and cool they felt in her hands. She stacked them into little towers across the hillside. Balance, she explained with a grin. You keep the weight low and the base wide, just like life. Silas smirked. That sounds like something out of one of those books you keep under the cot. Maybe it is, she laughed, then added, maybe you'll read one with me someday. He raised an eyebrow. Out loud? She raised hers back. Unless you're scared. That earned her a rare, full smile, the kind that made the corners of his eyes crinkle like they used to, before time and grief took their toll. That night she read him poetry, just a page, one about stars and silence and choosing love after the fire. Silas didn't say much, but he didn't fall asleep either. He just watched her. And when she finished, he whispered, You've brought more than warmth to this cabin, Rosalie. She tilted her head. What then? He exhaled slowly. The reason to keep the fire going. The firewood stack had never been higher, not because winter was close. It wasn't. The sun still lingered late into the evenings, and wildflowers blanketed the meadow behind the cabin. But Silas kept chopping, not out of necessity, out of habit, because even joy, when unfamiliar, made a man reach for the axe. Rosalie watched him from the window one morning, flour dusting her apron, hands wrist-deep in dough. She smiled to herself. There was a rhythm now to their lives, quiet and strong like a river carving stone. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. She stepped outside, her hair in a loose braid, cheeks warm from baking. If you keep stacking wood, we'll be ready for 10 winters, Silas grunted, just in case. She wiped her hands on her skirt and walked to him. You ever think about what next year will look like? He leaned on the axe. I try not to. Rosalie looked up at him, eyes steady. Maybe you should. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch as the sky turned gold and the wind carried the first crisp whispers of late summer. She pulled out her notebook and tore a page from the back. Write down one thing you want, she said, offering him the paper. Silas frowned. I want what I already have. That's the easy answer, she said, smiling. Try again, deeper. He stared at the paper for a long time, then finally scribbled a few words and folded it. Rosalie slipped it into a tin box and added her own. No peeking yet, she said. We open them in winter, after the first snow. A tradition? He asked. A future, she replied. They continued like that for weeks, building, dreaming quietly. One day Silas returned from town with something wrapped in cloth. Rosalie untied the bundle on the kitchen table and gasped. A set of hand-carved wooden spoons, each one different, each one polished. They're beautiful, she whispered. Where did you find them? Didn't, he said. Made 'em. You did? He looked down, sheepish. Figured if we're going to keep eating together, might as well have a proper set. She didn't cry, but her fingers trembled when she held the one shaped like a heart. That night she whispered into the quiet, Do you think we'll always have this? Silas, already half asleep, replied, If we keep choosing it. She smiled. Then I'll choose it again tomorrow. His fingers reached for hers in the dark, found them, held tight. And in that moment, no promises, no ring, no papers, only two souls deciding again and again to stay. The season began to turn. You could feel it in the mornings. Cooler air creeping through the shutters, the hush before sunrise that hinted at frost. The garden slowed. The creek ran lower. And the mountain, ever patient, began its slow breath inward, preparing for sleep. Rosalie stood barefoot on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, eyes scanning the treetops. A handful of leaves had turned early, golden flares against the green. Silas stepped up beside her. Cold coming, he said simply. She nodded. And we're ready. That word we no longer felt new. It felt natural. That week, they cleared the chimney and patched the roof. Silas repaired the front door hinges, while Rosalie packed jars of dried herbs, wrapped bundles of kindling with twine, and stacked them neatly by the stove. She hummed while she worked. It was a tune Silas didn't recognize, but it settled in his chest like something he'd always known. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It came with the trader's boy, folded and sealed, addressed not to Silas, but to Rosalie Hart. She stared at the name, held the envelope as if it might burn her fingers. Silas gave her space. When she opened it that night, her hands shook only slightly. It was from a cousin back east, someone she hadn't heard from in years. They'd heard rumors of what happened, of Wade, of her disappearance. And they asked only one question. "Are you alive?" She wrote back the same night. "Yes, and more than that, I am free." As autumn deepened, Silas grew quieter. Not withdrawn, just reflective. One evening, as they sat on the porch beneath a sky smudged with stars, Rosalie turned to him. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. He took a long moment to answer. "I used to think solitude was strength," he said, "that needing no one made me unbreakable. And now?" He looked at her, then out at the dark forest. "Now I know strength is having something you'd fight to protect." She rested her head on his shoulder. "And something worth staying for?" she whispered. They didn't speak of marriage. There were no plans, no lace, no preacher riding up the trail. But one evening, while Silas carved a second nameplate to hang over the cabin door, Rosalie brought him a scrap of linen. She'd embroidered a word onto it, clumsy but careful. "Ours." He looked at it for a long time, fingers brushing the threads. Then he folded it, tucked it into his coat pocket, right over his heart. The first snow came early, soft, silent, a whisper from the mountain. Rosalie pulled out the tin box they'd sealed in summer, their wishes folded tight inside. They opened them together near the fire. Rosalie's wish was simple. "I want to be a woman who chooses joy." Silas's made her laugh, then cry. "I want her to stay, even when the snow comes again." She looked at him, firelight in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." And this time they didn't just hold hands. They held a future. The snow didn't stay light for long. By late October it thickened, layer after layer, until the world outside the cabin was blanketed in white. The mountain, once lush and golden, now stood quiet and still. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney. Inside, the fire rarely died. Silas chopped wood every morning, even when the snow reached his knees. He didn't complain. He rarely did. But each time he stepped back into the cabin, Rosalie met him with a towel, warm cider, and a look that said, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." And every time he answered her without words. Evenings took on a rhythm. They read beside the fire, she with her notebook, he with the newspaper from town. Some nights they played cards. Some nights they played music. Rosalie on the old harmonica Silas had long forgotten in a drawer, Silas tapping rhythm on the tabletop. But their favorite moments were the quiet ones, the ones where she leaned into his side, and he rested his hand over hers. No noise, no need, just warmth. One evening, as wind howled beyond the shutters and snow danced in the dark, Rosalie pulled a folded cloth from her sewing basket. "I made something," she said. Silas raised a brow. "If it's another scarf, I may vanish in wool." She laughed and handed it to him. It wasn't a scarf. It was a small quilt square, stitched carefully, precisely, with symbols sewn into the fabric, a pine tree, a small cabin, and 2 initials at the bottom, RH plus SH. Silas turned it over in his calloused hands, emotion catching in his throat. "It's for our bed," she said softly, "when we finish it." He looked up, his voice low. "Our bed?" She smiled shyly. "I thought it might be time." There was no proposal, no ring, no vows. But the next morning, Silas rode to town through heavy snow and returned 3 days later with a silver band wrapped in a cloth pouch and 2 fresh biscuits from the bakery. He handed her both, eyes steady. "Marry me?" Rosalie took the ring slowly, tears already shining. "I already have," she whispered. That winter they didn't just survive the cold. They lived through it, together. They danced once on New Year's Eve, just the 2 of them in thick socks, spinning clumsily across the wooden floor to the sound of her humming and the fire popping in rhythm. She called it their first anniversary. He didn't argue. In early February, they found the first sign of spring, barely visible, stubborn as love, a single green sprout near the creek. Rosalie bent down and touched it, then turned to Silas with wonder in her eyes. "It's coming back," she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and nodded. "So are we." By the time March arrived, the thaw had truly begun. Water trickled down the slope behind the cabin, carving small paths through the melting snow. Birds returned with cautious voices, and the pines shook off their icy coats. The whole mountain seemed to exhale. Inside Hartstead, life moved with intention. Rosalie aired out the linens, swept every corner, and opened the windows on days when the wind was more whisper than bite. Silas patched the barn roof and repaired the old chicken coop. grumbling as he did it, though Rosalie saw the way he smiled when she brought him tea and leaned on the fence to watch him work. They spoke more now, not just of the past, but of the future, of seasons to come, of crops to try, of maybe someday building a second room onto the cabin. But one conversation took longer to arrive, and when it did, came in a quiet, roundabout way, over a shared bowl of stew one rainy morning. "Have you ever thought about having a family?" Rosalie asked, her voice gentle, eyes not quite meeting his. Silas didn't answer immediately. He chewed, swallowed, set his spoon down. "I used to think it wasn't meant for me," he said. She looked up, but now... He reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. "Now I think maybe I just hadn't met the person I could build one with." Rosalie smiled softly. "What if it was already beginning?" Silas blinked. "What do you mean?" She turned her hand in his, palm up, and laid something small into it. A carved button, from the old coat she no longer wore. On the back, she had written a single word in pencil: "Soon." At first he stared at it, then at her, and something shifted in his face like the moment before sunrise when the darkness softens but the light hasn't yet claimed the sky. "You're sure?" he asked. Rosalie nodded, her eyes misting. "As sure as I've ever been." He stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her, not out of ceremony but because his legs didn't trust themselves to stand. His forehead touched hers. "You've already given me everything," he whispered. "And now, this." Spring arrived with full color that year. The garden bloomed early. Birds nested in the eaves, and laughter, real, rich, unapologetic, filled the cabin on more than one occasion. Silas built a new chair by the window, just for her. Rosalie began stitching a baby blanket in secret, though he pretended not to notice. When the midwife from town visited in late April, she brought with her dried herbs, advice, and a promise. "If you two made it through your winters," she said, smiling, "then summer will be a gift." Rosalie looked at Silas, her fingers resting gently on her growing belly. "I think," she said quietly, "we finally believe that." One evening, as golden light pooled across the cabin floor, Silas added a new name to the cedar plaque by the door. He carved slowly, carefully, just beneath Hartstead, "For all who come in love and never leave in fear." Rosalie ran her fingers across the fresh letters and rested her head against his shoulder. They didn't need to say anything. The mountain had already heard it all. Summer came like a hymn, soft, steady, and filled with warmth. The trees stood tall, with full green crowns, the creek gurgled with clarity, and every path around Hartstead was lined with wildflowers. Bees hovered, birds nested, and within the quiet heart of the mountain, two souls prepared for something greater than survival. They prepared for life. Rosalie grew slowly, beautifully, her steps lighter, her hands busier. She kept herself moving, baking, planting, stitching. But Silas noticed the quiet moments when she sat alone by the window, resting one hand on her belly, humming a lullaby that neither of them had taught her. He never interrupted. He just stood nearby, working leather or carving wood, and listened like it was the holiest sound he'd ever heard. One evening, a soft summer storm rolled in. They stood on the porch, side by side, watching the rain glide off the roof like liquid silver. Rosalie leaned into him, her hair damp with mist, and whispered, "Do you think this child will know what it took for us to get here?" Silas placed a hand over hers, strong, steady. "They won't need to know every detail," he said, "just that love was the reason behind everything." She turned to him, smiling through tears. "Then they'll know everything that matters." The baby came in early August, on a still moonlit night, when the stars stood watch and the air was thick with lavender and pine. Silas had prepared every blanket, boiled water, paced every board in the cabin floor. The midwife came at dusk, and by sunrise the mountain heard a new sound, a cry, strong and bright and filled with promise. A daughter. They named her Eden, for what they'd lost and what they'd found again. Rosalie held her with reverence, Silas with awe. She had his eyes in her mother's mouth, soft and fierce all at once. "She'll never know chains," Rosalie whispered as she rocked her. "Only roots." Silas sat beside them, quiet as snowfall, his calloused hand gently resting on Eden's tiny foot. "No fear," he said, "not here, not ever." That winter the snow returned as always, but it wasn't the same. This time the silence was warm, the stillness welcome. The fire was not just for heat, but for memory. The nameplate over the door, weathered and proud, now bore 3 hearts in its carving. Inside, a child learned to smile. A woman learned she was more than her scars. And a man, once lost to grief, learned to build not just walls, but a home. Whispers in the Snow was never a story about rescue. It was a story about choosing, again and again, to stay, to love, to begin. Even when the wind howls, even when the snow falls, even when the past tries to follow, because sometimes on the edge of the wild, a cabin becomes a sanctuary, and two broken hearts become one whole world.